Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the sixth part in our series, Rome, the Decline of Democracy. Where we last off, Caesar Augustus is finishing up his rule as the first true emperor of the imperial age, and has slowly rebuilt the rule of law within Rome, and has been tactfully grooming his heirs to take over in his place. Brett, let's continue onward.
Sounds good, Aaron. Thanks for having me back. So, Augustus Caesar is now standing at the top of the mountain, and he is accepted to be the de facto ruler of the republic. It's not really a republic anymore. It is now an empire. I mean, it was already an empire in the sense that it had conquered stuff, but it was an empire now in the sense that it had a sole ruler. Augustus modeled himself as the principate, or the first among equals. He's the leader, but he's not dominating people. He's not like telling people what to do because he wants stuff. He's telling people what to do because his ideas are the best, right? Who better to lead but the person with the best ideas? He has a very hands-off approach to leadership. He tries not to ruffle the feathers of anyone. He's very subtly spreading his influence. His heirs and the people who came after him would do well to take note of what he's doing here that's working so well. And some will, but others won't, as we'll see, to varying levels of effect. But at this point, the empire is very solid. Augustus has ruled for something like 40 years, and the empire's seen peace for the first time in a long time.
And I think that's important because, as we had discussed on the previous podcast, there had been like 4 to 5 civil wars, and having somebody, whether he's like the best guy in the world, having someone that's competent just becomes supreme after a while, right? We may not like the guy, he may not be like the most virtuous guy in the world, but anything, like at some point, anything is better than just constant bloodshed, and you'll take the most competent guy in the room to just run things at some point.
Oh yeah, and Augustus did work to ensure that the Senate felt valued. He played this really subtle game of simultaneously building the Senate up into an organization with prestige again, because of course, the Senate should be a prestigious organization, right? They're the seat of government for the greatest empire the world has ever known, according to them. But while building up their prestige, he was also stripping away their authority,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Playing this dual role of making them feel like they're important while also cutting away all of their importance.
Absolutely. And as we discussed, he's grooming his heirs to take over, right? So this is becoming more of a nepotism sort of model of rule.
Oh, yeah. So Augustus is having these military parades that are called triumphs, which are a very important quasi-religious ceremony in Roman culture at this time, where when a general wins a great battle or victory, they get to have this really I'm hesitant to say cool because people die during them, but let's just say cool military parade called the Triumph, where you parade around the treasures that you took from the enemy, and paintings are commissioned that show your glorious battles against the barbarians, and you parade the captured soldiers and usually some sort of leader figure through the streets of Rome until you get to the Temple of Jupiter, where they were ceremoniously strangled to death.
Wow, wow,
But
wow. And we think that like I think of like the Soviet era like parades with the nuclear warheads on the back of tanks, but that seems pretty gruesome, right? Like
yes, Rome always prided itself on not being a human sacrifice society, because they did come in contact with some societies that were into that kind of stuff. But it does make you think the ritualisticness of the killing on a temple step after a great victory definitely has a kind of, I mean, a religious undertone. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, yeah. I think my thoughts like harken to the Aztecs and things of that sort,
Absolutely.
who would take their they would conquer other tribes that were living there and do that. And I guess it's just in group affirmation. Like these people are other, and we have conquered them now, and a few of them have to die, and we have to celebrate that.
Yeah. Society. technology changes, societies don't. Um,
Let's hope we don't get back to those parades, my friend.
yeah, fingers crossed. I think we'll do a little bit better this time. But yeah. So anyway, so during the reason I bring these up is because during these parades, Augustus has his nephews riding with him, which is like sending a very clear message that like these are my next of kin. These are the people who will be taking the reins when I'm gone. This is who I want ruling the empire. Unfortunately, the best laid plans of mice and men and all that, what ends up happening is everyone that he has in mind for ruling the empire dies of
Wow.
various problems, right? Disease, accidents, but they die. And he ends up having to go with a person who he doesn't really like, which is interesting. It's like he really, really wants to avoid this relative of his, a man named Tiberius. Tiberius is eventually adopted by Augustus as his son because that's the rule. You have to like adopt them as your son so they can inherit your stuff, which is why what you'll see going on during the reign of the five good emperors is it feels like people are picking their successors, but to the Romans, it's a dynasty. It's like his son and his son and his son, right? So Augustus adopts his relative but not direct son Tiberius and elevates him to the purple, which is kind of what we say when we're saying someone is becoming the emperor, right?
Yes, yes.
And Tiberius is a bit miserly. He does a decent job. Things he does well are he's good with the economy. He doesn't like spending money. But things he does not well is he's very, very paranoid. Very paranoid. And he has people killed in treason trials for believing that they are like going against the regime, right? With little no more than just like, one person accuses another person and he happens to trust the one person more. So you're dead.
Wow.
Yes, right. He's paranoid. He is very paranoid. He's doing treason trials, basically executing anyone he even believes to have a hint of animosity towards his regime. And people do not like this. They're terrified. As he gets older, he gets worse and worse. One of the people that he has executed or assassinated, depending on where your coin lands, is his brother Germanicus, who is a war hero. He's younger than him. He's where Tiberius is kind of like frumpy and not very likable personality-wise. Germanicus is a hero. People love Germanicus, and he's getting jealous of him. He doesn't. It's unknown whether or not Germanicus had aspirations to be emperor, but what is known is that at some point Germanicus takes a trip to Egypt, which is illegal. People of senatorial rank are not allowed in Egypt anymore because Augustus knows that whoever controls Egypt controls the empire because of how rich it is, and so it's against the law. So as soon as Germanicus steps foot in Egypt, Tiberius has him killed.
Yeah, so this is, I kind of see sort of a you're crowding my spotlight sort of thing going on here, where even though Tiberius knows that his brother is not like doesn't have his eyes set on taking the throne, there is this idea of like there can't be anyone that can even come close to sort of taking up space in my spotlight going on.
Well, some emperors are like that and some aren't. Tiberius is definitely like that, though. You're correct. Anyone who's taking up the spotlight, even coming close to imperial aspirations, has to go. So Tiberius has his brother killed, right? He has him poisoned and allegedly poisoned. Sorry, and then his children, right? Sorry. So sorry. Let's go through this whole thing. Germanicus is assassinated. His wife is ordered never to remarry, so her new husband, but hypothetical new husband, wouldn't become a focal point for another regime. the oldest son is banished, and he dies of either starvation or suicide. And the daughters are sent to live with their great-grandmother, basically out of the way. They're removed from politics. The only one in the family who's left around to even be a thing is a very, very young boy named Gaius Julius Caesar.
Hmm.
And again, I apologize for the fact that that name is very similar to all the other Gaius Julius Caesars. I promise we'll give him a fitting name very soon. So Gaius Julius Caesar is taken by Tiberius to live with him in his like palatial estate, right? Where he basically tortures him, not like necessarily physically torturing, but tortures him like emotionally. He makes him into like his little slave boy, and he's like kind of he's like kind of teaching him how to run the government while simultaneously sending the message that like, if you cross me or do things that I don't like, I'll have you killed. And this kid is, all things considered, doing okay. And eventually Tiberius dies of old age,
Now
probably.
Tiberius doesn't have kids of his own, or what was it?
No, Tiberius has no kids of his own.
Got it.
Um, Tiberius has a grandson named Gemellus, but he doesn't have any direct children. And the thing is that Tiberius is grooming Gaius to be emperor
Hmm.
because Gaius is close to age where he could potentially rule, Gemellus being very young,
Got it. Got
right?
it. Got it.
So this emotionally scarred, probably suffering from PTSD child is now the emperor. Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar. But history doesn't remember him by that name. History remembers him by a nickname that was given to him by the soldiers in the military camps that he grew up in. It was Little Boots, or in Latin, Caligula.
Ah, okay. Okay. Now we're getting to some main eventers here.
Yeah, yeah, I figured you'd know that name. So this is the famous, or I guess I should say infamous, Caligula. Caligula, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is a nightmare, right? He has the grandson Gemellus assassinated. He has his sisters like moved into the palace where there's whispers of incest. He there's all the urban legends. He made his horse a consular. He he often, there's stories of him inviting senators to parties and then making the senators sit at the dining table while he takes their wives into other rooms to have sex with them. And then he would bring everyone back into the main living room where he would explain to the senator in gruesome detail what he and their wife had just done. And
Right.
if you showed any kind of like leanings of outrage or incense, executed. That's it,
Wow.
right?
Now, I want to touch upon Caligula a little bit deeper. And the story that I was told, and maybe this is not the true story, is that when he first started ruling, he started off okay, and then he contracted some kind of like syphilis type disease or something of that sort. Got really sick for a while, and that's when the batshit craziness started coming out. Is there any
Yes.
truth to that story, or
That is an anecdote of history that happened where Caligula was doing. People loved Caligula at first because he was the son of Germanicus, who was
hmm,
a beloved war hero. People loved him. They called him, like my shining stars. They called him like my glowing babe. They loved Caligula at first, and Caligula seemed to like them. He threw lavish parties. He had games. Romans love their games, right? They love those Colosseum games, and it's true. He got sick with an illness, and many senators who loved him at the time were saying things like, and this, I want to be clear that this is an anecdote. This may not have exactly happened the way I'm describing it, but it is a historical anecdote, meaning there are first there are primary sources that say this happened. Whether or not we can believe these sources is one thing, but I think it's interesting to note is that, so these senators were saying things like, oh, oh, if Caligula could get better, then I would die instead. Kind of like in modern English when someone says like, no, God, take me instead, right? And he did get better. And he heard what these senators had said. And he said to them, like, so he's like, thank you so much for your kind words, but I'm just confused as what are you still doing here? And they're like,
Hmm.
excuse me? And he's like, well, you said that if I got better, you would give up your own life. And it seems like you're still here and breathing. And I just wouldn't want the gods to think that you'd go back on your word. And he forced many senators to kill themselves just because they had said that little figure of speech.
Now I want to look. This is by no means true, but I'm just going to play a little historical analysis here, and I'm wondering when Caligula is quote unquote on his deathbed, right? Do you think it's possible that some of these other senators or other high-ranking officials maybe started plotting their own thing, like, oh well, this guy's on the way out. I'm going to start taking over this and that, and maybe to some degree he was kind of privy as to what was going on. Like, oh, this is how the rats act when they think I'm on the way out. It might also be, and again, I don't know if there's any primary source documents or anything that can confirm this, but I'm wondering if just laying there on his deathbed, that there was some indicator or some hints that people were plotting to have their own plans of how the empire should be ruled, and then miraculously he gets better and he kind of doesn't forget that. He doesn't forget how people act while he's on his deathbed.
That's definitely a possibility. Many Roman emperors are shaped by their opinions of the Senate. There's a guy named Domitian who we're not going to talk about in too much depth, but it's exactly what you're describing, where like before he was emperor, he saw the two-facedness of the Senate, and then when he became emperor, he took a very adversarial approach to them. And it's possible that Caligula had the same thing. However, Caligula was already doing bad things behind the scenes even
Hmm.
before his sickness. He was running through all the scrimping and saving that Tiberius was doing. Caligula was already burning through it.
Got it. Got it. Now the horse incident that happens after the illness, right? Like that's like post illness
Mhm.
Caligula. And again, like, so no one knows if that story is exactly true. I mean, heck, when I used to teach ancient Rome, I used to tell that story, and I kind of had the attitude of like, true or not true, this is going to get kids interested, right? And I
Yeah.
would kind of go in full steam with it. And just thinking about this idea of like putting like an animal in charge or something like that, is it also just a way, like, I'm wondering, because there is this like interpretation, oh, this guy is just sick and crazy, right? And that's like the very easy approach to go with, like, he's crazy, he thinks a horse is smarter. But do you think it's also this like message sending of like, you guys are so corrupt and so freaking messed up and so useless that this horse over here has more value than you'll ever have? I think there's also some posturing that's going on here. It's not necessarily just the and again, like when I first heard the story, I thought, oh, crazy dude. Let's laugh at the crazy guy, everyone. Ha 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 ha. But now that I think of the story even more, I'm like, I think there's some really strong posturing and message sending that's going on with this stuff.
Yeah, I mean that is why he did it. He literally said, "You people are so incompetent, a horse could do a better job than you."
Ah, okay.
It is that. It is
He
that.
actually said those words. Wow,
Well, he
wow.
said them in Latin, but yeah. They they it was not him thinking a horse would be a great consular. It was him sending a message, you people are so terrible, a horse would do a better job than you would. He used to make them like chase after his like he would ride an carriage, and then the senators would have to like run after him on foot, right? All of this was just to embarrass them and make them look foolish. He hated them. But
Hmm.
he also did some insane things, like he declared war on the oceans and Poseidon, which obviously, sending your soldiers to collect seashells in England is insane. It's totally insane. And the soldiers did not like that. There's no reasonable reason that he would do something like that. Syphilis, which is what they think he suffered from, one of the side effects of suffering from it can be that kind of like mental rot,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's possible that even though he recovered, he never recovered, so to speak. He was reviled, though. Running through all the money and making an enemy of the Senate made him reviled. he was assassinated by his own guard, the Praetorian Guard, which is something that we should probably touch on. Before Augustus, soldiers were not allowed in Rome, period. There were no police either. That's not a thing. So basically, no one in Rome was allowed to really have serious weapons. People had like clubs, right? But like you couldn't carry like a sword or a spear or like an AR-15 around. That was for the army only. When Augustus took over, he said that he changed the rules so that one legion was allowed to be stationed in Rome. I think it's one. It might be a couple more. The point is that he allows some soldiers to be stationed in Rome as the personal guards of the Principate. And they're called the Praetorian Guard. And we'll see more and more as time goes on that they go from passive bodyguards to being like the literal power in Rome. They guard the emperor when he sleeps, right? So, that's a lot of power, right?
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
And in this case, they're going to start exerting their first ever kind of like influence by assassinating Caligula.
Wow. So I guess he becomes like the first Roman emperor to be assassinated, right? I guess.
Well, Caligula claims that there's some evidence that Caligula killed Tiberius, but we're not sure. He's the first one to that we know of to be assassinated. Number 3. Pretty good, Rome. You did pretty good. 3 whole emperors.
No, it's really interesting because I'm just so mixed on this with I want to believe the craziness. It makes it is there, and maybe there is this. I'm wondering, could it be possible with the collecting seashell stuff that's later people writing these stories to slander him and be like, oh, look how crazy that guy was. We had to take him out. He was wasting our money and having our soldiers collecting seashells. So, I'm wondering how it is, because we might have all of these propaganda, like these ancient almost propaganda pieces trying to make someone look highly incompetent, as like sort of a rationalization to why they killed him.
Yeah. And one thing that we have to be really careful of is, just like in modern politics, we like to slander our political opponents by calling them corrupt, right?
Yeah.
That's like a big thing in modern politics, to be like, this guy's corrupt, watch out for this corruption. That's like everyone's favorite way to put down a politician today. In antiquity, especially in Rome, the way that you would slander a politician was generally sexual deviancy.
I see.
Right? That's how you would put down a politician. So when we read about Caligula being...
that used to work here, but I guess no.
It doesn't as much. Yeah, but you're right, but it doesn't as much. It's, in my opinion, a totally uninformed opinion, I feel like today that's like the buzzword of the day.
Yeah.
To be like, watch out for this guy, he's corrupt. People hate corruption. This guy is in the pocket of special interests. This guy, he's taking money from lobbyists, he's corrupt. And then if you did that in Rome, if you were like, don't support Augustus, he's corrupt, people would laugh at you. And they would be like, of course he's corrupt. They wouldn't even know what that meant. They would be like, what do you mean corrupt? And then you would be like, well, he's taking money from people who have special interests in the country. And then they would be like, so? That's what he's supposed to do. What's wrong with you, right?
That's like calling him a man or something, right?
It would be like, yeah, or it would be as laughable as saying you shouldn't trust this business because they charge people money for their goods. You'd be like, of course they do. What do you expect them to do, right? So the buzzword of the day was sexual deviancy, and so we should be real careful when we are reading about emperors that the Senate doesn't like.
Yeah.
And then we read that they're sexual deviants. We got to remember that the regular populace generally don't write history. It's written by these rich people who, 1, can read and write, and 2, have the time to read and write. And 2, it's written by these people who have an agenda.
Yes.
Right? So Caligula was likely a bad emperor.
Right.
But he maybe wasn't as much of an insane sexual deviant as he's made out to be historically.
No, because this is really important, because I feel like every single president that we ever have, maybe starting like with George W. Every president always gets compared to Hitler at some point or another. We kind of have this like radical idea, and I'm wondering like what future generations are going to think if they ever find. I mean, first off, we have a lot more media than there was in ancient Rome, but like I feel like there's so much. We always try, and we have these like, I guess, outrageous clickbait stories about every single president, every single ruler is made to be some kind of giant monster.
Mm.
And while we have more media that's kind of producing this isn't new. Like
Oh,
comparing, vilifying someone you don't like to the absolute extreme with hyperbole is something that has always existed and always will exist. And it takes a lot of work. It takes like a lot of work to find like unbiased accounts and very neutral accounts depicting somebody.
we see that in ancient Rome at people comparing their political enemies to Caligula in the future, not the far future, not like our future, but like 100 years down the line, right? We see that already. And what you're talking about with the clickbait articles, they had that. They had people standing on street corners yelling, Caligula is having sex with senators' wives and being a deviant. He's not good for Rome. He's not good for our glorious empire. We need to replace him with someone else, right? Um,
Whoa, this is amazing because a lot of us are blaming like social media for our ills, right? Like, man, if people just went on Facebook or Reddit or something a little bit less, but it seems like we've always had the clickbait mindset. We just didn't have the technology at that particular point to employ it. But like there were clickbait like town criers, like I think you mentioned in a
oh
previous
yeah, and I
podcast.
mean, like, if you want to talk about like a lot of things that we hear about today, or one of the things that we hear a lot about today is the internet's role in the spreading of misinformation,
Yeah.
right? And I see a lot people saying things like this is being done on a scale that's never happened before. The internet is a totally new thing, and its spreading of misinformation is being done on an unprecedented scale. And one, first of all, that itself is misinformation, so good job there. And two, what people are forgetting is that there have been communication revolutions throughout history.
Mm-mm.
And it's we're going a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but some of the first books that were printed on the Gutenberg printing press were books about how to recognize witches, and they were all false. And it's I would love to talk more about it another time, but I'll give you the very brief ins and outs of it. Is there are famous witch hunters who were ousted by the church for being basically lunatics. The church accepted that everyone accepted that witchcraft was a thing. It was not in the early medieval era. It was not a question of whether or not witchcraft was real. It was real. It was a question of whether or not people were using witchcraft to do bad things.
Right,
Right.
right.
And so there were people who said, I can catch bad witches. This is how you do it. And the church, sometimes they would be like, okay, this is a good way to catch witches. And sometimes they would be like, no, this is not a good way to catch witches. And there were plenty of witch hunters who the church basically ostracized and said, like, you're out of the church because you are too extreme. This is not correct. You're using it to hunt down your political enemies. You're using it to further your own agenda by giving everyone someone to hate. You're out. And they turned to the printing press, which was like the internet of the time. It was a way that people could get the message out without a lot of infrastructure. You know,
Yes.
you didn't need a network of town criers. You didn't need an army of scribes copying your literature, which is the way that literature got copied before the printing press, right? All you needed was a publisher.
Now, turning back to ancient Rome for a second here, how many of the average citizens, like what percentage of the population at this point is literate in the time of Caligula?
Almost none.
Okay, almost none. So I think that this also connects with this idea of like there's a general lack of education, a lack of
Well,
literacy.
it's actually, it depends what you mean by literate. They can read some words. Like they can recognize like the word bathhouse on a building,
Got it.
but they're not going to be reading any books.
And that's the equivalent of like somebody driving and seeing a stop sign. Like they see the word stop.
Yes.
Like it's along those same lines. So when you have this like festering population that's not very literate, they're going to be attracted to like, oh, that guy's sleeping with his wife, and then like that they're kind of like the reptilian mind is more activated and more triggered at this point, where it's like that's really interesting, whereas no one has actually taught them like the complexity of like, well, Caligula's taxation policy is actually saying blah blah blah, like they're not thinking, the population hasn't been groomed to make really informed choices.
Absolutely. We suffered from that even today.
Yes, we do.
I mean, a lot of people in America know how to read, so that's not as much of an issue now. But the problem is that the game gets more complicated. It's not enough to know how to read. You need to know how to analyze. And it's becoming to the point where it's not even enough. It's not enough to know how to read. You have to be able to think critically and
Yes.
make informed decisions. And even now, it's starting to become that's not enough. You need to know how to read, a given, and you need to know how to think critically, and you need to be able to do the basic analysis on data required to draw your own conclusions. This 2020 election, just like the 2016 election before it, saw unprecedented failure for pollsters and pundits to properly model election results. Right? They got it wrong. They got it real wrong. They underestimate Trump, they overestimate Hillary, they overestimate Biden, they underestimate the Senate, they overestimate the House. Clearly something is wrong either in their polling or their modeling that is resulting in way off numbers.
Right.
But the fact is that if you don't have the tools, if you're not a data scientist, if you don't know how to do two-tailed tests, if you don't know how to do regression testing, then you lack the tools to look at data and be able to make your own decisions. You have to trust the statisticians themselves and hope that they're coming to their own conclusions. And I think a lot of people forget that critical thinking, statistics, and even reading are soft skills, or are at least somewhat soft skills.
Sure.
There's room for interpretation. There's room for guesswork.
Yes. Right. Now, I think at the very least, like, I don't know if we can all, elevate ourselves to the role of data scientist, but at the very least, it seems like with Caligula, there's an appeal, like there's an emotional appeal, right? Because I think when you tell somebody, hey, this dude is sleeping with other people's wives and forcing them to watch, well, that's, regardless of my level of data science and so forth, that's just triggering me an emotional level. And I think we see a lot of that going on in our media today, where it's like, forget about even getting people to read regression studies. They're just, you put something out there and it triggers their emotional primal urge, and that just shuts them off. They're not into any form of facts whatsoever, because now they've been completely lost in the back part of their brain. And I think this is an old technique, and I'm glad that we're touching upon it with ancient Rome, because it's good to know where it comes from, and that it has been done many times over.
Well, a lot of it in Rome at this time is not necessarily, because remember that it's an empire, an emperor, an imperial system of government. So it's not necessarily that they're trying to convince the populace to oust Caligula. It's more like they're just whining a lot and the population is hearing it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
They're pissed off, and that's what you say about people you're pissed off. You call them sexual deviants. You compare them to Hitler, right? Like they weren't doing it as much at the time. Only a few people knew who Hitler was. They're probably time travelers, but they were whining, they're complaining, right? They hated him, and the results are, we know we can debate back and forth on whether or not Caligula was a sexual deviant, whether or not he was insane, but what we can't debate as easily is that he did completely drain the treasury, where his predecessor was doing a good job of building it up. And also he brought back treason trials, which he promised he would get rid of. We have records of his speeches where he said no more treason trials. He did this whole big showy thing where he burned up all the evidence in fires around the city, and it was this huge celebration. And then later on, he comes around and is like, actually, I made copies of all the evidence and treason trials are back on.
Oh
right?
God.
Yeah, exactly.
and that,
Oh
and
God.
that's something. Okay, now again, draining the treasury, it doesn't make for as juicy of a story, but that's kind of like the important things that we need to really train people. And I think that's a really legit reason for wanting to oust somebody from power, and you can actually point to those things. So I feel like when we're analyzing somebody, we just saying the truth, right? Just saying the truth of like, this guy is draining the treasury, that's not going to make people cry, and it's not going to activate their emotional glands. So we have to also have this added fabrication of like, he's draining the treasury and he's sleeping with that dude's wife. So it's like that's almost like, I'm just thinking about like, the people that are in power are very smart in that they know that just saying the truth isn't really going to get our attention. There also has to be like emotional baggage in what's being spread as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's definitely something to be said about making people not like your opponents,
Yes,
right? It's
yes,
harder to follow people you don't like, regardless of what they're doing.
yes, yes, yes. And in Caligula, he was doing some very dirty things. So this emotional stuff probably was like an unjust means to a good end, getting rid of a corrupt dude. But sometimes it's used for even more nefarious purposes. You might have a good ruler, and now the emotional stuff is being used to kind of slander their good name.
Yeah, you have to kind of like pick through the truth and the fiction and try to understand what's true and what's not. Like, I believe, based on the evidence, that he probably wasn't incestual. His relationship with his sisters was probably more of like post-traumatic stress disorder survivorship kind of
Yeah.
stuff, where like they all survived Tiberius together. And so he felt a very close bond to them. And they were a little bit older than him. So he probably saw them as like mother figures. But
Mm.
like the story of him like banging senators' wives and then bragging about it, that probably happened. I believe that happened.
I mean, it definitely. I'll keep telling people it happened because it's just so freaking interesting.
Definitely. I definitely.
Brett. It's like we still have our little reptilian minds in our heads as well. Like we're not above it.
Nope. Nope.
Okay, so the dude is assassinated now.
Yeah. So Caligula is assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard knows they need someone to put in his place,
Yeah.
right? And the person they decide on is his uncle, a man named Claudius, who at the time was believed to be. This is actually really, really funny because this is kind of what's going on right now. Claudius is Claudius is a little bit physically infirmed. He walks with a bit of a limp, like a genetic birth defect, and he has a stutter. He's not a great public speaker.
Okay.
Because of this, people think Claudius is like literally mentally invalid.
Oh my God, jeez.
Stop me if this sounds familiar, by the way.
No, it's like it's really amazing, right? Like,
History it's just a circle. So Claudius, and Caligula keeps Claudius alive because Caligula kills a lot of people in the inner circle during the treason trials, but he keeps Claudius alive because, one, he doesn't see Claudius as a threat at all because he thinks Claudius is literally slow, and two, he likes using Claudius to just make fun of him. He's the butt of the jokes, right? He keeps Claudius around as like a clown.
Jesus.
And Claudius is like this good-natured, quiet, stuttering guy who's introspective and thoughtful and intelligent, and no one knows because no one will give him a chance, right?
Smart. Let me tell you, man. I think I can. I'm gonna like play a little ancient Rome psychologist here.
Here we go.
I think Claudius is thinking in his head, yeah, I'm a buffoon. And he's doing that so that they don't kill him, right? He knows,
Yeah.
he knows like, yeah, I'm too stupid to figure that out. And he knows if he keeps playing the clown, his chances of survival are going to increase. And this is all like that. I'm almost sure that's what he's doing. No one can know for sure, but if I'm playing armchair expert with that, I think that's his game plan, man.
Absolutely.
Like,
It's a combination of Claudius doesn't want to die, and it's a combination likely of someone who's been beat down their whole life, kind of like accepting their lot in life as a buffoon And they're like, of course I'm a buffoon. That's what I am. Everyone's told me that since I was born, so why would I think I'm anything else? And Claudius ends up being like a really good emperor. He ends up being great. He fixes the economy a little bit. He takes Britain. He reinvades Britain, something that hadn't been done since Julius Caesar, right? He's I don't want to say he's beloved because again, people are really put off by the stuttering, right? And the physical maladies, but he does a good job. History remembers him as a good emperor now for the things he did for the people. He helps build the economy back up. He does lots of public works buildings. He helps the people of Rome. He turns Rome back into a more respectable city, a more respectable empire. The Senate, even the Senate likes him, right? Like he does a good job of doing what Augustus had done before him, of kind of like deferring to the Senate on matters and like building up some of their bruised ego that surely Tiberius and Caligula, delivered to them. And the only thing that he really struggled with was his love life. And it's amusing because it's those struggles that are going to spell huge problems for Rome in just a few years.
Wow, wow. I think this is a good place to end off. And I want to stress here, and I think one of the problems that we have, and this is a problem that's haunting us today, is that we tend to favor rulers who appear strong, and we're not necessarily attracted to rulers who appear intelligent or kind-hearted. Like I've had this I've talked about this topic before, where we tend to think that kind people are weak. And this is something that is really ingrained in our nature, where kind-hearted person is weak and strong person is much better to rule. And it's actually, in many instances, it's quite the opposite. Like the person who walks with a limp, the person who we think is just not that aggressive, probably has some really great ideas. Like you said earlier, they're probably highly introspective, and if we just gave them a chance, they'd probably surprise us.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Is that the projection of strength is often a sign of weakness.
Yes, yes. I think the old saying goes, it's like, if you have to show your strength, you're probably all not, you're not that strong. And I'll even bring in a study. I'm like, I'm not the tallest guy in the world. I'm only 5'8", but you'll notice that guys who are like 6'4", 6'5", or are really tall and really intimidating looking, they hardly get into any scraps or into any fights, right? And there's this idea that like they have hidden strength, or people who do martial arts, for example, tend not to get in that many like altercations outside, because they have that inner strength and they don't need to necessarily project a persona of strength, because it's already there. It's already embedded within them.
When I was in school, I remember reading a study about the difference in posture between police officers who carry weapons and police officers who don't. And they found that police officers who are unarmed stand with very aggressive posture, arms
Mm,
crossed, legs forward, chest out. And then police officers who are carrying weapons stand with relaxed posture. And
right.
the possible reason for that is that the ones with guns don't need to look aggressive. They know that they're safe. And the ones that don't have guns feel more threatened and so are projecting strength.
Yes, yes. I think that idea, and unfortunately, I think society is tricked by this. We see the guy acting ultra alpha male, ultra aggressive, and we think, oh, strong ruler right there. And we need to start training ourselves to realize that it's not the guy beating his chest the hardest that's gonna really get us to the promised land. It's really the more quieter, more introspective amongst us that might be better suited to rule. Brett, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you again for having me, Aaron. It's always a pleasure.
This concludes the sixth part of our series, Rome, the Decline of Democracy. I'm Aaron Azarod.